Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to Darien Library this evening. Before I begin, please turn off your cell phones. And I just briefly want to mention that this program is made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you for your donations and your continued support to make events like this available to everyone in our community. Tonight's guest joins us from MoMA to discuss Ileana Sonnabend, Ambassador for the New. In a career as gallerist and noted collector, Sonnabend shaped the course of post-war art in Europe and in North America. In addition to introducing American pop art and minimalism to Europe and bringing Italian Arte Povera to the United States, she sought out and championed many of the most, I guess you would say, significant artists in her day. Our speaker is the Assistant Curator of Programs at the Yale University Gallery of Art and a lecturer in the Education Department at the Museum of Modern Art. She received her Ph.D. from the CUNY Graduate Center in 2010 with a specialization in 20th century art, photography, and film studies. Please join me in welcoming to Darien Library Molleen, I will say, Theodore. Thank you. You're welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be back at the Darien Library. Can you hear me? Yeah? I was here in the fall talking about MoMA's collection, and it's a pleasure to be back. I'm also very happy to be talking about Ileana Sonnabend. She's someone who has intrigued me for a long time as an art historian. I studied, as she just mentioned, 20th century art in graduate school, and specifically the period of the 1960s and 70s, which is when Sonnabend is really making her name. And I'm interested in exhibition history, and when I was doing research for my dissertation, I would always look at exhibition histories, and you see gallery Ileana Sonnabend come up all the time as having had all these very important shows in the 60s and 70s in Paris and New York, and yet she's not really in the history of the art history as it's written thus far. And who's in there all the time is Leo Castelli, who she was married to and who she was really lifelong best friends and art collaborators with. So she's an interesting figure, and I'm happy to kind of bring some aspects of her to greater prominence, and I hope that we can talk about some of the issues that I brought up when I'm done speaking. So I have to ask, how many of you have seen this exhibition? Yeah? Okay, great. As I was saying, she was an incredibly important gallerist in Paris beginning in the 1960s and in New York in the 1970s. She was a great art supporter really until her death in 2007. And it's worth thinking just in practical matters why a gallerist and a collector is important. Artists rely on support, financial and emotional, in order to make art, and Ileana provided that. She provided that in a very strong way in showing artists and giving them exhibitions, in believing in their work, and in introducing them to larger communities, as you just said, Americans to Europe and Europeans to America. She is really, in a way, responsible for the art trajectory of Robert Rauschenberg, whose work Canyon is on the left, which you surely saw if you went to the MoMA exhibition. And she was instrumental in the career of Jasper Johns, whose flag is on the right, Jim Dine, Vito Acconci, and very many others. The list goes on. She championed what others deemed difficult art, and I think in all of these ways, she's very much part of this history of art as a supporter and as an ambassador. As I said, she was married briefly to Leo Castelli. They remained very, very close friends, and he is really thought of as the most famous art dealer of all time. And his fame sometimes even eclipsed the fame of the famous artists he supported. So he is a very important figure. But as we'll see tonight, in many instances, she was the instigator in the operation. She was very, very important to his success. So, I want to tell a few different stories tonight and weave them together. I want to talk about Ileana and her biography because it's interesting. I want to talk about how she becomes an important woman collector and also what it means to be a collector. I want to talk a little bit about taste because I think it's not hard to look at this work on the left and kind of wonder what in the 1960s, someone was thinking about hanging this work in their home, for example. And this is a work that remained in Ileana's possession until her death. And of course, I'll talk about artists and actual artwork too. So let's think for a moment about what it means to be a, yeah?
Can I ask questions?
Sure, or you can wait till the end. Maybe that's, yeah, great. Let's think for a moment about what it means to be a collector and a gallerist because she was both. There's an important German writer named Walter Benjamin who talks a lot about collectors. And he says, for a collector, and I mean a real collector, a collector as he ought to be, ownership is the most intimate possession that one can have to objects. So think about when we're looking at a work like Canyon and other works that we'll see tonight, what that intimate connection is that Ileana had with these objects. A collector is someone who acquires objects that they want to own for aesthetic reasons or sentimental reasons, or sometimes because they think it's going to be worth a lot of money at some point down the road. Usually a collector wants to be surrounded by their possessions, and sometimes there's a relationship between the artist and the collector, as well as the art object and the collector. Ileana is unusual in a lot of ways. She collected art, but she displayed very, very little of it in her home. She herself said she wasn't a very possessive person. She would also, which is totally unusual as a collector, she would sell objects in order to support her gallery. So her gallery wasn't the biggest money-making enterprise, but she would sell her own works in order to keep it going. The work of a gallerist is quite different. That's someone who is hoping to make money on art, support artists certainly, but make a living out of it as well. She really wasn't interested in the material aspects of her job, and I'll tell you a few anecdotes about that along the way. Being a gallerist involves sometimes being kind of shrewd. She definitely could occupy that kind of personality. And also some kind of playing nice with others. She did that sometimes. She was also quite difficult at other times. She's very, very hard to pin down, hard to categorize. And I would say that she was a pioneer, except I don't think that anybody could follow her. I will also say that and I probably mentioned this when I talked about MoMA, a couple months ago. MoMA was begun by three women collectors and supporters of art started MoMA. And there's many instances of women who collected art, who provided venues for art to be shown. But there's not at this moment very many women artists who have a place to show their art. And Ileana did not, I don't think she had any women artists in her kind of stable. So, her biography. She was born in 1914 in Bucharest, Romania. Her father was Jewish. He was a self-made industrialist and one of the wealthiest men in Romania. She grew up with nannies, with maids, with every comfort. In 1932, Leo Castelli came to Bucharest from Trieste, Italy, and Castelli promptly fell in love with Ileana's sister, Eve. Eve was already married. Eve was Ileana's great kind of competition of her life. And soon after that, and it was clear that nothing was going to happen between Leo and Eve, Ileana and Leo met. Castelli was 24 at the time. He was smart, ambitious, elegant, very well-mannered, and a great kind of really enjoyed life. He really enjoyed himself. And she recalls, this is a quote from Ileana, "I desperately wanted to get away from home. Leo was on the move. He was going to get out of Romania, and I was going to get out too, so I married him." Instead of a diamond ring for their wedding, she asked him for a painting, and together they chose a Matisse watercolor. So this was no great love match between Leo and Ileana, but they very successfully forge another kind of relationship, and we'll see that. They start out first living in Bucharest, but as anti-Semitism spreads throughout Eastern Europe, they move to Paris in 1936, at this point with their daughter, Nina. And Castelli had lots of different kinds of office jobs, ones that very often Ileana's father would set him up with. And he didn't like any of them very much. In Paris, Ileana's father set him up with a bank job, set the family up with an apartment, a chauffeur, a cook, a nanny. Castelli was really bored with banking. He did a little bit of art trading on the side. He spent a lot of his time having these romantic dalliances on the side, much to Sonnabend's frustration. And I think she kind of threw him out of the house a few times. 1941, as the to escape the war, they moved to New York by way of North Africa, Spain, Cuba, with their family of 3, with their nanny, with their dog, and then with something like 25 pieces of luggage. So she was someone who came quite literally with some baggage. Her father was already in New York. He had bought a townhouse on East 77th Street, and Ileana and her family took over the 4th floor, and they made their home in New York. A couple years later, Leo went to serve in the Army, at which point Ileana enrolled at Columbia to improve her English. And there she met a fellow student, an American, who she described as totally bohemian, and they totally hit it off. His name is Michael Sonnabend. That's who she ends up getting married to. And they become very, very close friends. When Leo returns from the war, she and Ileana and Leo decide to stay in New York. Leo gets set up again, once again, with a job through his father-in-law. But he does, in addition to the womanizing, he does some kind of art dealing on the side, and he gets more and more invested in that. Even as their marriage is unraveling, it's art that really keeps them together. It is their great connection. And they start looking at art together. In the early 1949, or early 1940s, mid-1940s, they start visiting Peggy Guggenheim's Art of this Century gallery on 57th Street. And this is the gallery that was showing Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and other artists who were working in the abstract expressionist mode. And there you see Jackson Pollock on the left, and Mark Rothko on the right. They didn't buy the work at first, but they met these artists, and they became part of this fairly small community of people very interested in avant-garde art. Leo and Ileana bought a house out in East Hampton near very many other artists. They were across the street from Robert Motherwell, near the de Koonings, near Pollock, and all of these people would come to the house on a relatively frequent basis. A fixture at the house was Michael Sonnabend, Ileana's classmate. He was quite small, I think about 5 feet tall. He was incredibly articulate. He was at that time teaching himself Italian so that he could read Dante's Inferno. So he was this very heady guy. And everybody just kind of thought of him as Ileana's friend. And really, besides Michael, Ileana wasn't very well liked in this group. She kept to herself. She didn't drink, which was actually a really big deal with this crowd of great drinkers. And she was brutally honest and sometimes mean. In one instance, Willem de Kooning, and that's, I have one of his women paintings up here, he was telling Leo that he should start a gallery, trying to convince him to start a gallery. And at one point, Ileana just stopped him and said something like, "I think Leo will open a gallery and that you won't be one of his artists." And de Kooning asked for an explanation, said why, and she said that he would focus on what was coming up, what wasn't already established. So she was very to the point. Didn't really worry so much about what people thought of what she had to say. So I want to just step back for a moment and give a little bit of art history with this idea of this interest in embracing what's new and not what's already happened. I think it's worth getting a picture of why what's new is so new and so radical. So just to go back quite a ways. I'm putting on the screen here this work by Cezanne, a still life from the end of the 19th century, where you see an artist really playing with this tension between realism and abstraction, between a two-dimensional flat plane reminding you that you're looking at a canvas that has been painted by an artist, but at the same time giving you hints of three-dimensional space. And that really had been the goal of artists for hundreds of years before, to give you a painting that was a window onto the world, that you would see, you would look at, and you would think you were looking out into real space. So there's all these tensions here between the 2D, 3D, and the realism and abstraction. And Cezanne is one of the artists who starts moving toward abstraction. Picasso certainly follows him. This is Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. And this is right on the eve of Picasso inventing Cubism with George Braque. And Cubism is kind of the, you could say, the movement of the early 20th century, where he completely changes the way artists conceive of space, moving away from this single point perspective or a window onto the world, and really fracturing space and planes using geometry. And this is an artist, as Cezanne was, who knew perfectly well how to create a three-dimensional illusion, and yet he chooses to do something else, to invent a space rather than just recreate one. So that was 1907. Just a few years later, in 1913, the artist Marcel Duchamp starts looking around his studio and around the streets of Paris and picking out objects and calling them works of art. On the left, we have the bicycle wheel. So he takes the wheel off his bicycle, a perfectly useful object made useless when he turns it upside down on a kitchen stool, another useful object, and calls this a work of art. He calls it a ready-made. On the right, we have the most famous example of Duchamp's work, which he called The Fountain. That title infuriated people. He was a Parisian who really loved New York. He loved the plumbing in New York. He would always say that. And on one trip to New York, he was part of an unjuried exhibition, meaning it used to be that if you wanted to exhibit your work in a salon or in somewhere official, you had to get voted in by the jury. And around the 19-teens, artists start thinking about not having juries for their exhibitions, just letting everybody in who wants to be in, and then let the public and the critics make the choices. So he was involved in this unjuried exhibition, went to a plumbing supply shop in New York, picked up a urinal, and if you don't think about what it's for, it's white and shiny and has some curves to it, and he puts this in an exhibition, and people really kind of ignored it. They thought it was just an obnoxious joke. And no one pays very much attention to Marcel Duchamp for a couple decades. And it's not really until the 1950s, and we can look at some artists that Ileana championed, start to bring the ideas of Marcel Duchamp back. The idea that a work of art can be based in an idea, and that you can look to the outside world for your material. That a work of art is less about craft or less about brushwork or the hand of the artist and more about the mind of the artist. So if Paris is the center of the art world in the late 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, in 1942 that really shifts, and the center of the art world is New York. There's even a book that's titled something like How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art from Paris. But there's this very real thing that happens, which is that very many artists who would have gone to Paris stay in New York. Artists who are in Paris come to New York. So it becomes this great center. And in the wake of the atrocities of the Second World War, very many people are looking for a new way to communicate and a new way to express themselves. And the artists of this abstract, what we call abstract expressionists, like Jackson Pollock, really take this very, very far. Jackson Pollock was schooled in figurative and representational painting. He knew perfectly well how to paint like that. And around 1946, 1947, this is an example of one of the first times that he does this. He takes his canvas, which had been on an easel so that you stand in this dignified way and paint. He took it off the easel and put it on the ground and started pouring and splashing and splattering paint on a canvas. You can also see some fingerprints. I'm going to try out the pointer. Yeah, it's not that great. But you see fingerprints over here. You can see him stepping on the painting. He throws things in here. He was known to drink a lot of beer. He would throw the beer cans in here. He would smash cigarettes out on this surface. So the everyday world kind of comes into the painting. And the process of making the painting is actually quite significant. He moves around the painting, the canvas is on the floor. He moves around it almost as if enacting some kind of choreography. This work was a critical and a financial sensation. He was celebrated by the critic Clement Greenberg for creating work that was abstract. And Clement Greenberg celebrated the abstract quality of this work because he felt it was the perfect way to communicate at that time. And also that art had kind of done everything it could do with representation, and that abstraction was where it needed to be at that moment. Notice also that, and in this one as well, there's a way in which the work could almost be flipped. There's not a clear top or a bottom or left side or right side. The artist really pushes to all the sides. When you look at it up close, and it's actually quite different to experience it in real life, and I suggest you do that next time you go to MoMA, you can get a sense of the process of the work in terms of what went down first, but it is abstraction and work that does not directly reference anything that was celebrated at the time. And it was celebrated so much that there was actually really great pressure on artists not to paint with a subject, to completely remove the subject and embrace abstraction. And artists who were coming up in the early 1950s felt this pressure to paint just like Jackson Pollock and others of his cohort. So it's the story of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg is significant for a number of reasons, but one of them is certainly that they were two artists who kind of found a way around abstract expressionism, and we can talk about how they did that. So here we have the Jackson Pollock on the left in his mode of painting, and Jasper Johns on the right, kind of one generation after another. So in February of 1957, the Castelli Gallery, Leo Castelli, opened a gallery in the couple's living room in their apartment. And the first few shows were fairly traditional and acceptable, and within a short period of time, Leo was showing works by Jasper Johns and by Robert Rauschenberg, and that's who we have pictured here. He came to know these artists and support their works largely thanks to Ileana. So I want to talk a little bit about how that came to be. Leo had seen a group show at the Jewish Museum, and in that there was a Johns painting that he was completely intrigued by. And Ileana had seen Rauschenberg in an exhibition in 1951, and apparently when she saw him, she said something like, "Who is that young prince?" And she kind of had him in her mind for a while and really wanted to meet him. So they decided to go to pay a visit to the studio of Robert Rauschenberg on Pearl Street, and they went to see his combines. What he was known for making, and this is a term that he came up with, the combine, is part sculpture, part painting, works of art that combined scrap wood, stuffed birds, stuffed animals, an old quilt, a pillow, objects from the real world that he would find on the street and kind of bring into his paintings. And she and Leo were totally into the work. They went to his studio and they were really into the work. Rauschenberg, who was known as Bob, lived in the same building as Jasper Johns. They were friends, they were collaborators, they were sometimes lovers, and on the most practical level, they shared a refrigerator. And Bob had Ileana and Leo in his apartment, and he said, I'm going to run down to Jasper's loft to get some ice. And they didn't realize that he lived right there and said, we're coming with you. And what they find in Jasper's apartment is what Ileana said seemed like a formal exhibition of Johns' work. He had it installed in his loft space. They loved everything. Ileana bought a painting right then and there, and Leo immediately offered Jasper an exhibition. And John said, what about Bob? And there was no answer. So Rauschenberg kind of invites them in, and Johns is the one who walks away with kind of all the goods. And the visit was quite devastating to him. Rauschenberg came to the Castelli Gallery a few days later, and he said to Ileana, I need to know, are you going to give me a show? And it just so happened that Leo was out that day. And Ileana said, yes, sure, we're definitely going to give you a show, and she gave him a date. I don't know if Leo would have done the same thing, but in any case, within days, both Leo and Jasper and Rauschenberg are on the roster for exhibitions. Rauschenberg and Ileana had a very close relationship, and I want to just read a quote. He said, it seemed to me that Leo went for the intellectual side and Ileana for the sensual. Let's just say I never finished a painting without wondering what Ileana would think of it, which I think is perhaps the ultimate compliment. John said, Ileana takes more pleasure in art and artists than Leo. I don't think Leo likes work in that way. He likes to sell art. So you kind of see both of their strengths. So Johns has this one-man show at Castelli Gallery in January of 1958, and by most measures, this exhibition changes the course of contemporary art, showing artists and collectors that there's this viable option outside of abstract expressionism. He shows a work called Target with Four Faces. You see that on the right over there. That work was also featured on the cover of a very important art magazine. Alfred Barr, who was long the director of the Museum of Modern Art, came to the opening. He stayed for 3 hours, and he bought 3 paintings for the museum. So that's a pretty big deal for an artist's first solo show. And all but 2 of the paintings were sold in the show. So here's 2 more examples. White Numbers on the left is the work that Ileana bought straight out of Johns' loft. And on the right is Flag. And that really very clearly describes what I think is so innovative about, and what was so revolutionary about Johns' work. Everybody recognizes that as an American flag. So this is something that has symbolism and meaning to us. But it's also lines and stars. So in a way, he neutralizes the subject. He takes what I think was most compelling about abstract expressionism, this removal of the subject, and plays with it by neutralizing the subject, by choosing these subjects that you have kind of built-in meaning with, but they also can be read as these kind of abstract shapes and designs. He does that with the flag, with the target, something you immediately recognize, and yet it's concentric circles at the same time. He does it with the U.S. map, with numbers, and these representations, in a way, replace the need for a subject. He also, and this is something that you can see when you see it in real life, is that he paints in this really laborious way. So in the work on the right, he uses a method called encaustic, and there's newspaper that's put down on the surface, and then he uses this hot wax technique. He puts hot wax on the painting and paints pigment into that. So it has a very textured quality to it. It's actually 3 canvases put together, and not only did the flag have this the flag was everywhere in 1955, you also have the clips from the newspapers that one can even read to kind of put you in that time when you look at this work. Rauschenberg also had his solo show. That was met with considerably less success. Only 2 of the paintings were sold, one of which was to Castelli, and that was Bed, which is now at MoMA. Have any of you seen this? Yeah? Okay. So it's called Bed. We see beds on a horizontal plane. This is pulled up to a vertical plane, so it is a work of art. This is an actual quilt. I believe it was a quilt that was given to him by the artist Dorothea Rockburn. It's an actual pillow on the top. So you see the sheet that gets pulled down, and the quilt is there, covered in these drips of paint. And the drip should make you think of Jackson Pollock. He's kind of referencing Jackson Pollock in a way. You have the abstraction of the drip, the painterly method of the drip, and yet we recognize this fully as a bed. It's useless as a bed, and that should remind us of Marcel Duchamp and his play with the ready-made. While people were totally smitten with Johns' work, I think Rauschenberg's was much harder to digest. Both Johns and Rauschenberg were included in MoMA's 16 American shows in 1959, which was an incredibly influential show that kind of told the future direction of art, and it was a group of artists largely taken from the Castelli Gallery. So Castelli was this important source of exhibitions for museums as well as galleries. As the gallery shot to fame, the Castelli marriage was falling apart, and in 1959 they divorced, which was a move instigated by Ileana. I think Leo probably would have let it go on and on. He continued to always consult with her about art and artists, and that continued throughout their lives. For example, in 1961, he asked her to visit the studios of, and this is a shot of Jasper Johns on the right with Leo Castelli and with his second wife, who I think had been their daughter's nanny. And you see the flag up there, that work that he had bought from the show. Leo asked Ileana to visit the studios of Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein because he was trying to decide between these two artists and who should he represent. And at the time, they were both working with comic strip images. Ileana said, they're both very, very good. You should take on both of them. Leo took on Lichtenstein, so he didn't totally take her advice. He didn't think that Warhol's work was quite as good, and 3 years later, he ended up taking on Warhol. So even when he didn't take her advice at first, he eventually took her advice. In 1960, Ileana and Michael Sonnabend married. She proposed, the story goes. And they decided they would move to Europe. They tried to find a gallery to represent the artists who they were interested in. And at this point, Johns and Rauschenberg, they have no representation, no reception in Europe. But they couldn't find anyone who would cover the cost of insurance and shipping. So they settle in Paris, and they open a gallery in 1962 in Paris. And they open it with an exhibition of Johns' work. And you see here that white number painting on the left and a work called Device by Johns. This is in November of 1962. And in January of 63, they have a show of Rauschenberg. So you see that very many of the shows that happen at Castelli also happen at Sonnabend. So I want to talk for a minute about this work, Canyon. It was considered one of Sonnabend's favorite possessions. She was asked at one point what should happen to Canyon, and she said, well, if they'll build a pyramid for me when I die, I'd like to have it in there with me. So she felt a very, very close connection to this work. The central piece of this work is this taxidermied bald eagle. Its wings are spread. It has a trussed pillow hanging from its claws. So it's kind of bringing this American symbol and emblem together with a reference to Greek mythology. And the scene is when Zeus, as a bird, abducts this boy that he is after. Let's look at a few close-ups. You can see it from the side. You'll notice on the right,
there's a piece of a shirt that's cut out, and then shirt over here, you see the button, you see the side angle of this trussed pillow. There's a photograph all the way up there that's of Rauschenberg's young son, perhaps also a reference to this mythological story. It's a chaotic and subversive painting. If you saw it in the exhibition, I think you probably got a sense of that. And it really complicated, notions of what was American art. The eagle almost appears as a trophy in this work. And it has, the eagle has a kind of master painting quality to it. It also is very much, I think, in defiance of the lyrical beauty that everyone loved in Jackson Pollock's work. There's something very, I think, difficult about this work, and people really struggled with it for quite some time. Rauschenberg had begun making combines in 1959, and he would literally walk the streets looking for material. Whatever the day would lay out is what he said. The bald eagle was found among trash thrown out in the hallway of a building, the Carnegie Hall Studio building, and it was given to him by another artist. And Johns and Rauschenberg and others would often find material on the street and hand it over to one another, saying, "Oh, I think you might want to use this in one of your works." This was in Sonnabend's collection until it was given to MoMA. Because the work contains a bald eagle, and the eagle is an endangered species, it couldn't be sold. And when Sonnabend died, her collection was appraised, and her family appraised Canyon at $0 because of the eagle. You can't sell it. The IRS disagreed, and they estimated it at $65 million, and they wanted to tax the estate accordingly. So they made a deal that if the estate would donate the work to a museum, they didn't have to, the estate tax would be waived. So that's how MoMA got this lucky gift. There were a few stipulations of the gift, and one of them was that they needed to have an exhibition, which is part of the reason for Ileana Sonnabend, Ambassador of the New. Excuse me. So she followed the exhibitions of Johns and of Rauschenberg with exhibitions by pop artists, and she's really responsible for bringing pop art to Europe. This is an exhibition of the work of Roy Lichtenstein, and you can see that in the curtain, certainly. This is Little Aloha, a work by Lichtenstein. He was at this time getting his images from comic books and advertisements. So he would project an image on the wall, trace the composition, and then paint the work. He wanted it to look machine-made, even though it was handmade. He's using an incredibly limited palette here, just this purplish blue, the red on the lips, plus black and white. And then he paints in these beige skin-colored circles. They would have been Ben-Day dots on the source image. And this work was included in the first Sonnabend show. She also showed the work of Claes Oldenburg. In America, Claes Oldenburg was making these massive and colorful fabric sculptures like this burger that you see on the left. And in making these objects, he was really responding to the massive showrooms that he was seeing on Park Avenue, the massive piano showrooms and car showrooms. But when he went to Paris to visit her exhibition, he had a different idea. He spent some time in Paris. This is Claes Oldenburg and Ileana on the right. He went to the bakeries of Paris, and he made these everyday objects, these tartines that you could have bought in Paris. And in making them, he used plaster of Paris, and he used tempera, because he felt that captured the muted qualities of Paris. But Ileana would invite the artist to Paris and give him some time to make the work. So while he was in Paris for her show, he came up with this idea and then produced the work. Warhol too, that's Warhol on the left at her gallery, and on the right she displayed, or actually she tried to display, what were his death and disaster paintings. He's someone who I think we think of, Coca-Cola and Campbell's soup cans, very positive images. He was also obsessed with what was appearing in newsprint at that time and all the publicity or journalist shots that weren't getting published. And in the early 1960s, what was being taken very often were shots of car accidents. There were very, very many car accidents. More people had cars, more people were driving, and people weren't, using seatbelts and all that. So he would take these photos that he would get from the newspaper and reproduce them very many times, as you see on the right. So that's orange car crash. I think it's 14 times, and you see it in a grid over and over and over. These works were not popular, as you can probably imagine, and yet she embraced this work and introduced it to the European audience. In the case of the disaster series, she actually had it shipped to New York, or shipped to Paris, but it couldn't fit in the gallery. The walls were too short. So it gives you a sense of, the bigger American space. So, and that's Warhol's Ileana Sonnabend. He was a great voyeur. So the shows were well attended and they were mocked. Many people didn't like the art. They resented the kind of audacious American presence and dominance of the European art world. Ileana sometimes refused to show work by European artists who she thought weren't advanced enough, and this really bothered them. So this is just a funny work that a Belgian artist made where Ileana's sitting there with one of the artists she represented, an Italian artist, and he says, "Do you like the pop?" But this is a work of art. In 1964, Robert Rauschenberg won what is the biggest prize for an artist, the International Grand Prize of the Venice Biennale. It's a huge award and a huge honor. And Castelli was given virtually all of the credit for this happening, but it was really Ileana who worked from Paris, kind of spreading the word of Rauschenberg everywhere. This is going to sound kind of weird, but just before she left for Paris, Rauschenberg gave her a good luck charm. It was a half-sucked lifesaver encased in metal, and she wore it for years. And Rauschenberg said, "The lifesaver means what it means. It became an icon of our friendship." But that is Ileana Rauschenberg and Michael Sonnabend on the left. In Paris, she continued to show the most difficult art, and she showed, after pop art, she showed minimalism. This is an example of kind of post-minimalism, the work of Robert Morris, where he used felt pieces, and he was interested in the way in which felt was unpredictable. He would stack it, he would fold it, he would hang it. He said, every time you hang the same felt piece, the action of gravity changes it. You can't visualize your outcome. So he was interested in the kind of uncertainty of it, and she embraced that. So she's someone who, it's very hard to see a kind of aesthetic thread through what she supported. She was always supporting what was new, but not absolutely everything. I mean, it turns out when you look in retrospect at who she supported, she very often would choose, I think, what others have now recognized as the most important as well. This is Ileana at an exhibition of the work of Larry Bell. So she showed conceptual art, performance, and dance and video. She even figured out a way for artists to circulate videos, which I think was incredibly advanced at the time. And she took on European artists and developed European collectors. She was a shrewd negotiator. She sometimes played clients against one another. She would tell a client that a certain work wasn't for them, even if they wanted it. One time someone asked her, they were trying to buy a painting, and they said, "Do you know who I am?" And she said, "Yes, I do, and the price is going to be higher." So she was, I think, she's playing a game, and a risky, adventurous game that she really enjoyed. The political turmoil of 1968 made it very hard for her to continue with her gallery, and she decided to return to New York, and though she kept the Paris gallery going, she really focused on what was happening in New York. Her gallery became an art center. It was never about money, but I think she ended up getting, more joy out of the New York gallery. She had one on Madison Avenue, and then opened another one that one opened in 1970, and then in Soho in 1971, at the moment when Soho was becoming a contemporary art destination. And in Soho, she occupies the same building as Castelli, so they're really, really still working together. She was, as I was saying, there's no clear aesthetic thread that links all her work. There's no clear direction except for newness. She was attracted to what baffled and excited her, what surprised her, what troubled or upset her. She said, I like what I do not at first understand. I only want what I don't like. Which I think is not how everyone approaches how one should make art, or how one should collect art. To talk about a surprising work, for the performance artist Vito Acconci's first show at Ileana's Soho Gallery in 1972, he performed 3 pieces, one of which was called Seedbed, a work where he built a wooden ramp at the one end of the gallery, and he stayed underneath the ramp, and you can see a glimpse of him on the bottom, where you couldn't see him if you entered the exhibition. There were mics and speakers, speakers underneath, mics underneath, speakers on top, and he, underneath this ramp, masturbated and kind of whispered fantasies to himself for the 2-week run of the show. So visitors could hear him, but they could not see him. People were outraged. I think people are still outraged by this, but they were certainly outraged by this at the time. When she found out what he was proposing, all she said was that she was worried that he would get hurt. So she wasn't worried about her reputation. She wasn't worried that there's not a single thing from this that you can sell. I mean, that I think is very significant for her as a collector. She wasn't worried about making a sale. Maybe you could sell a photograph, but that's really it. I mean, there's not a lot to make money off of in this kind of work. And just as she had introduced New York pop to Europe, in the 70s she introduced European artists to New York. She introduced the artists, the Arte Povera artists of Italy, like Mario Merz here, artists who used poor or humble materials. And again, this work really defied the art market. She supported German artists, the neo-expressionist artists such as Immendorf. She supported Jeff Koons and Peter Halley, the New York East Village scene, and you're seeing really that there's clearly no aesthetic thread here. And they came to Ileana's gallery because they liked the history of it. They liked that there weren't too many big-named artists. They liked the way she displayed work, and they found it always provocative. There were artists who left her gallery. Jim Dine, whose work is here, this is called Shrewd, is an example. And it sounds like the leaving was bittersweet. He said, "I have never known anyone who had more feeling for my work. She always made me feel that there were more possibilities for it," which is kind of the ultimate support you can give someone. But ultimately, he left because he needed financial support. He had a family, and he wanted an income he could rely on. He said he never saw a statement from Ileana. Whenever you asked for money, she would take out a wad of cash of different currencies and kind of peel back a few bills for you, and he wanted more from that in his art career. But still kept this connection to her, and I think really respected her practice as a collector. And if you read, there's this wonderful book that MoMA put out that has very many quotes from artists, and you see in it that they all talk about her having so much feeling for the work, having this kind of sensual response to the work, which I think brings us back to Ileana's impact and her legacy. And her legacy is certainly on display at MoMA now, as her works kind of go out into the world and are not always connected together in an exhibition. I think that legacy will change, but I'm happy for this show and for the way in which it really writes her into this history that she is very much a part of. So I'm going to end here, and I want to open it up to questions. Yeah?
William Costelli alive?
No. Oh, that's a good question. I don't think he's alive.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. She died in 2007. Actually, he's definitely not alive. He died first. And she was, I think she was really devastated by his death.
Was the first gallery that you showed that I recognized with the American flag painting, where was that gallery?
That was on, I believe it was on 57th Street. I don't know the exact location.
So is that, you said they had it in their apartment, so that might have been the first gallery that they had?
He started in their apartment that was I think on 74th Street, and then he moved to a gallery on 57th Street. She had a gallery on Madison Avenue and then a gallery in Soho, a building that was shared with Costelli and Andre Emmerich and John Weber. Yeah.
Did she reject any artists who then became recognized as excellent or great?
That is a good question. I don't know. Costelli did. I don't know that she did. I think that some artists didn't want. I know of stories where there were artists she wanted in her stable who didn't go to her. So I think she bought out the exhibition of the German artist Anselm Kiefer, and she really wanted him to come to her gallery, and he didn't. He went elsewhere. So I certainly know of instances where people went elsewhere or were with her and then left, like the Jim Dine story. I don't know of an example where someone came to her and she said no. She had a really great eye, and I think her kind of braveness and willingness to take risks really paid off for her. Paid off, not in a real financial way.
Why didn't she collect or pursue any women modern?
Yeah, I don't know. I find that it's troubling, certainly. It's not uncommon. Not that makes it okay. It takes another couple years for collectors to more wholeheartedly support women. Costelli does take on a few women. Costelli supported the career of Lee Bonteque, and I don't think I had an image with her work, but Lee Bonteque was a very, very strong artist in the early 60s who Costelli represented. I don't know that women came to her, but there is, in the early 60s, it's pretty hard to be a woman artist. And even into the 70s, or late 60s, there's still a number of artists who I think the feminist movement tries to absorb, and they really reject it. So there's this really complicated relationship. And if you think about the women artists who we know, like Lee Krasner, Lee Bonteque, Jo Baer, they have super androgynous names, and I don't think that that's by accident. It was hard to get representation and hard to get support. There's a great article, if you're really interested in it, there's a great article by the art historian Linda Nochlin called "Why Are There No Great Women Artists?" And it's this polemic where she talks about why there aren't great women artists, and she goes through all these different, answers the question in all these different ways, like were there great women artists and we didn't notice? And what she concludes is that there actually weren't, because women weren't given the same education as men. Like you couldn't draw from the figure, you weren't allowed in classes, and you had all these expectations in other realms of life. Anyway, long answer. I wanted to just I forgot to say one thing in answer to your question, is that she did sell some paintings. She sold 2 works to Cy Newhouse for something like $20 million, and he really wanted them. She kept him going forever, but then eventually sold them just because she says something like, sometimes I realize how old I am and I have to think about the future. But I think it's hard for her to part with works when she does, or was hard for her. Yes?
I had heard that there was a lot of controversy around this exhibition because it was the first time that it was an exhibit of a gallery owner and a collector as opposed to an artist.
I don't know that it's the first time, but I can certainly see the complication. I think you can understand MoMA's problem. They want the painting, but they have to do a show. So they're going to take the painting definitely. And in the way that they did the show, if you walk around the exhibition, you would notice that I think all of the works that are in the exhibition are works that are in museum collections. And I think MoMA does that for a reason, because they don't want to have works on display that are possibly going to come up for sale. Because then the museum is kind of like a place where you're showing, inflating the price potentially of works. It's a tricky business, I would say. I don't know that it's the first collector show.
I thought I had heard that.
I can't think of another one off the top of my head, but I don't know that it's the first one. But it's definitely a tricky situation, and especially so for a place like MoMA. So you mentioned that I also work at Yale, and at the Yale Art Gallery is really all about donations and collector gifts, and that's something that we have collector shows, and I think there's a different it's a different relationship to the collector. I guess they also could have just shown works that were in MoMA's collection.
Was she educated in art in any way, or just her eye told her everything?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think she was surrounded. Oh, this is not. I don't have the exact answer to your question, but there's an anecdote I read that when she was a kid. So her sister Eve, who Leo fell in love with first, she was apparently the more beautiful one. And when Ileana was growing up, her mother and Eve would go shopping in Vienna, and they would always drop Ileana off at the museum because she liked going to the museum more than she liked going shopping. So she spent a ton of time at the museum. I don't know exactly where she was educated. I know she had governesses, so maybe she was educated. And then she went to Columbia, but at Columbia, she largely, the main purpose of being there was to study English.
Was she actually Romanian?
Yeah.
Both parents were Romanian.
I believe so. You had a question?
You talked about the influence of Jackson Pollock.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just interested to know why maybe she didn't go after acquiring any of Pollock's work, or was he already established?
He was already established. I don't know that I don't think she acquired any Jackson Pollock. That would have been old to her, I think. And also, I mean, on a practical level, at that point he was already pretty expensive.
And she was someone who's looking for new.
She was always looking for something new. Yeah. I think she also didn't feel very at home in that world. But I don't know. I believe that Leo showed Paul's work in a few group exhibitions, but I don't know that Elena